My name is Captain Daniel Knox. I'm 44 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I was stationed at Fort Redstone, where I served for the last 2 decades. I was halfway through a logistics readiness briefing when Colonel Bray raised his hand and cut me off. At first, I thought he had a question. Instead, he cleared his throat and told the room that this would be my last official meeting. There was no warning, just a flat announcement that the command was restructuring and my role was no longer aligned with their new direction. I stood there, holding the remote in my hand, the screen behind me frozen mid-slide. For a split second, I thought maybe I'd misheard, but the silence in the room said it all. A few heads turned, a few eyes avoided mine. Bray didn't look at me. He kept talking like it was just protocol, like pushing a man out after 20 years was nothing but an item on a checklist. I stayed where I was, kept my face still, and nodded like I understood. The truth is, I did understand. Not the decision, not the timing, but the politics. I'd seen it building for months. Bray had only been in command for 6, and already he was tearing down the systems we spent years building. He wanted speed over discipline, disruption over order, and I didn't fit his mold. I was the last piece of the old guard, and apparently, that made me a liability. It wasn't personal, he said later, just strategic. But if you've ever had your name scrubbed from the command list while your boots are still warm on the floor, you know it's never just business. I'd led missions in the desert, trained logistics teams from scratch, saved the space from multiple operational failures, but none of that mattered now. Not to them. I walked out of that room without saying much. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew they weren't listening. They'd already made up their minds. I shook the hands that were offered, ignored the ones that didn't bother. I picked up my folder, tucked it under my arm, and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't turn back. That's the thing about quiet exits. They give people the impression that you're finished. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I knew this place better than anyone. I knew its systems, its weaknesses, and exactly how much it depended on the parts no one ever thanked. They thought they could replace me. They had no idea what they just triggered. I gave that base everything I had. 20 years of my life, most of my prime, poured into building systems that could withstand chaos. I wasn't chasing glory or medals. I just wanted things to work. Soldiers needed gear on time. Supplies needed to arrive where they were supposed to, when they were supposed to. And for 2 decades, they did. Because I stayed up late, double-checked schedules, and trained every logistics officer that came through Fort Redstone to respect the process. I watched young recruits grow into leaders. I saw men and women who had never touched a manifest turn into sharp, steady operations officers. We didn't move fast. We moved right. Every improvement I introduced, every workflow I restructured, came from experience, not guesswork. You can't fake that kind of knowledge. It has to be earned, piece by piece, in the field, in the heat, when mistakes cost lives. Then Colonel Bray showed up, and suddenly none of that mattered. He came from outside, all buzzwords and briefings, talking about agility and modernized command theory. He called our operations slow. He said our protocols were outdated. What he meant was, he didn't understand them. And rather than learn, he decided to replace. He started small. A bypassed meeting here, a skipped signature there. I'd raise concerns, and he'd smile like I just handed him a paperweight. The first time he ignored one of my risk assessments, I thought it was a one-off. By the 3rd time, I knew it was deliberate. He was moving fast because he didn't want to be challenged. And I was in his way. What stung wasn't just the disrespect. It was the arrogance. Like he believed the foundation we'd laid could be discarded overnight without consequences. Like loyalty didn't count unless it came with applause. I'd sat through nights when transport planes were grounded mid-supply run. I'd pulled triple shifts during snow shutdowns, stayed back to make sure fuel routes were rerouted in time for deployment. I didn't do any of it for recognition, but I did expect respect. Instead, I got dismissed like a policy memo. Bray didn't say it outright, but I could hear it in the way he talked. His vision didn't have room for people like me. Veterans, builders, the ones who made sure the engine kept running while others polished the hood. It was all about speed now, rapid cycles, agile turns. He called it progress. But I knew better. You can't skip steps and expect the structure to hold. You can't tear out the support beams just because they're not pretty. And you sure as hell don't sideline people who've kept the house standing through every storm. I watched him replace experienced staff with consultants. He moved budgets around like poker chips, confident there'd be no fallout. And maybe that's when I realized the hardest truth of all. Loyalty only matters when it's convenient. As long as you're useful, you're indispensable. The moment you question the new direction, you're excess. That's what I became. Not because I failed, but because I remembered how to build things that last. I should have walked away. Most people would have. Let the place fall apart and never look back. But that's not who I am. Fort Redstone meant more to me than a uniform or a paycheck. It was a piece of my life. And if they weren't going to respect that, I'd find another way to remind them what happens when you forget who built the ground you're standing on. A week after I cleared out my office, I had lunch with an old friend from the academy, Nate Harris. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we'd kept in touch enough to know where the other stood. Nate had moved into defense contracting after his injury, and he'd done well. Too well for someone who used to sleep through logistics briefings. He now held a minority stake in Patriot Systems, the software vendor Fort Redstone used for all its supply chain management. We kept the conversation light at first, just two veterans catching up over barbecue and stories. But I steered it toward Patriot soon enough. I knew their tech inside and out. I'd helped integrate their systems during my last 5 years at Redstone. What most people didn't realize was how deeply Patriot had become embedded. Without them, Fort Redstone couldn't schedule a shipment, let alone prepare for deployment. And Patriot was quietly expanding. Not loud, just smart. Nate was still sharp, but he liked to talk. Over brisket and beer, he mentioned a pending buyout offer. A quiet shift in board seats. I didn't press. I just listened. And later that night, I made a call. Not to Nate, to my financial advisor. I wanted a position, small but meaningful. I didn't need control, just access. Just enough to nudge certain conversations in the right direction. This wasn't about payback. It was about positioning. I'd seen the writing on the wall. Bray thought he could replace people with speed and software. That was fine. I'd just make sure I owned the software. Let him run fast. He had no idea who'd paved the road. And while he was busy tearing down the system, I was already building something better right beneath his feet. It started with a shell company in Delaware, clean name, no direct ties to me. I used a second entity to open negotiations on a stake in Patriot Systems, claiming it as part of a private equity strategy focused on niche defense vendors. The numbers looked right, conservative, stable, low profile. No one blinked. Within 8 weeks, I had controlling interest split between 3 corporate entities, each legally distinct but aligned under my signature. The board never saw my name on a single document, but my terms were there. Every contract involving Fort Redstone, especially renewals or new deployment modules, required a supermajority, which meant me. I didn't ask for a seat. I asked for leverage, quiet power, legal veto, nothing flashy, but absolute. I spent nights reviewing Patriot's code architecture, flagging dependencies Fort Redstone couldn't operate without. Their logistics hub was a black box, beautiful, efficient, and utterly reliant on Patriot's back-end access keys. Keys I now controlled. I rewrote the vendor roadmap to delay minor updates that looked routine but created choke points 3 months out. Nothing catastrophic, just inconvenient. At first, Colonel Bray had no idea. He was signing contracts with timelines that now ran through my hands. By the time the cracks started showing, I'd be 3 moves ahead. Every system he accelerated would hit friction. Every shortcut would meet resistance. The dominoes weren't falling yet, but they were balanced, tipped, aligned, one breath from collapse. and I was holding the air still. 3 weeks after I handed in my ID badge, the first glitch hit Fort Redstone. It was small. A shipment of night vision units went missing between warehouse check-in and armory confirmation. At first, they blamed a clerical error, then a software sync delay. But the system had never done that before. Patriot's interface flagged a batch override with no signature trail. By the end of the week, 2 training exercises had to be rescheduled. Munitions delivery was late. The scheduling software pushed backup dates into next quarter. Someone flagged it, a tech sergeant from supply, maybe 26, sharp kid. He brought it to his superior, who passed it up. It landed in Colonel Bray's inbox. His response was 2 lines, standardized comms, no further delays. But the delays kept coming. Tactical gear listed as delivered hadn't arrived. Vehicle readiness reports were incomplete. Live data streams were glitching during readiness audits. No one could say why. Every error was just clean enough to be plausible, just messy enough to raise suspicion, but there were no red flags, just a slow erosion of order. Inside the ops room, junior officers whispered between check-ins. One finally spoke up. Lieutenant Myers, logistics rotation, tried to raise the issue during morning brief. She had data, reports, timestamp mismatches, and questions about new software updates that no one had authorized. Bray cut her off mid-sentence. He told her to stay in her lane. By the 5th week, the base was jittery. Schedules shifted daily. New orders came with outdated parameters. Mission prep took hours longer. Backup stockpiles were tapped early. Bray started snapping at staff in meetings. He blamed the old systems, the legacy processes. He had no idea those processes had already been stripped from under him. What no one at Fort Redstone realized yet was that they were standing on a foundation held together by muscle memory and software duct tape. The cracks were no longer spreading. They were deepening, and Bray was still pretending it was weather. Bad luck. Growing pains? He didn't know the storm hadn't even started. It came as an email flagged high priority. Subject line was clean. Request for consultation. I opened it slowly, letting the moment sit. It was from Fort Redstone Systems Division, signed by someone I trained 5 years ago. The language was stiff, formal, carefully worded to avoid admitting anything outright. But the meaning was clear. They were asking me to come back. Not for a ceremony, not for advice, for help. I read it twice. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. The sun had just dipped behind the skyline, orange cutting through gray. I felt nothing at first, just the cool edge of validation. I wasn't surprised. Not really. The signs had been pointing to this for weeks. But seeing it in writing, that was something else. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, but I answered. A voice I hadn't heard in a year came through low and tight. Sergeant Mason, former comms lead. We'd shared enough late nights running diagnostics that he didn't need to say much. He said Bray was cracking, that the systems were slipping faster than anyone could track, that people were starting to ask questions they weren't allowed to ask. I listened, said little. Mason paused, like he wanted to say more but knew better. Then he said it anyway. Bray's trying to pin it on you, he muttered. He says the old systems were flawed from the start. I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I thanked him and hung up. Then I opened the folder I kept on my desk. Top document was the licensing agreement for Patriot Systems software suite. I flipped to the last page. My initials sat beside every clause that mattered. The final one gave exclusive veto on all Fort Redstone contracts to the primary stakeholder. That was me. When I walked back into Fort Redstone, the air felt different, not colder, just quieter, like the walls were waiting. The officers seated around the conference table stood when I entered. Out of habit or respect, I couldn't tell. Colonel Bray didn't stand. He sat stiff, eyes forward, jaw tight. No one smiled. No jokes, no pleasantries. The chairs were filled with the same ranks who had once called me by name in hallways. Today, they waited for me to speak first. I did. I told them I wasn't here to reclaim anything. Not a desk, not a title. I wasn't rejoining the command structure. I didn't want the uniform back. What I did want was operational oversight of Patriot Systems base integration. All logistics, all tech dependencies, all pipeline command. From now on, it would route through me. There were glances, mutters. One of the majors cleared his throat and asked why I was here if I didn't want to return. I explained it simply. Because your systems are failing, because you no longer understand how they work, and because I do. They pushed. Asked if this wasn't a conflict of interest. I reminded them it was already written into the license agreement. Bray shifted in his seat, but still didn't speak. The base legal officer looked at his tablet, then at me. He confirmed the clause. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then the base commander nodded. Slowly. He said he understood. That they would cooperate with Patriot Systems lead consultant. My role. My terms. He offered me a liaison to ease the transition. I didn't need one. Bray still hadn't said a word. I looked at him. He didn't look back. But his silence said enough. He knew. Everyone in the room knew. The structure he tried to build without foundation was already cracking. I wasn't here to punish him. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was enough. This time they listened. And this time I set the terms. I stood just beyond the training field, hands in my pockets, watching the next generation run drills beneath the winter sky. Their boots hit the dirt like drum beats, steady and sharp. I remembered that sound. I remembered what it meant to show up every day, to lead with care, to build something that could outlast you. This wasn't about getting even. It never was. I didn't fight back to tear anyone down. I fought to remind them that what we build with discipline, with patience, with integrity, deserves more than silence at the end of the road. It deserves respect. The base looked the same, but something had shifted. Not in the buildings, in the air. In the way people greeted me now. In the way Bray avoided my eyes. I didn't walk away with a medal. I didn't need one. What I took back was mine to begin with. And maybe that's the thing no one teaches you when you start serving. Sometimes, the mission isn't to follow orders. It's to remember who you are when the orders stop. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what refuses to fall when someone tries to erase it.